Tuesday.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the main event of the evening for the Worldwide Wrestling Federation Heavyweight Championship.
Wrestling.
Ladies and gentlemen, our first event of the evening is a one-fall match with a 15-minute time limit.
There ain't nobody in wrestling who can make me quit. And that's the bottom line, cause Stone Cold said so.
Tuesday.
We are what wrestling's all about. New York City here, Chicago here, JD on my left, Linda on my right. But I'm not telling any of the girls who I'm going to give it to in Chicago until that night. Woo!
Tuesday, Wrestling. Tuesday returns to Under the Hood with Jonathan Hood on ESPN 1000 and the ESPN app.
Tuesday Wrestling Tuesday right here on ESPN 1000 and the ESPN app, also on the Under the Hood podcast. Jonathan Hood with you. As promised, we told Mike Mooneyham when your book is completed, we're going to have you on. And guess what? Mike Mooneyham, the Hall of Famer, is back with us. The best-selling author Mike Mooneyham returns with a collection of tributes that spotlight some of pro wrestling's biggest talents. Final Bell is the name of the book. Final Bell, Legends of the Mat Remembered. And Mike Mooneyham joins me, Jonathan Hood, here on ESPN 1000 and the ESPN app. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Jonathan.
I knew, didn't I tell you, that when that book's completed, you got to come on, because people have been asking, because they've already purchased the book and they want to hear from you. So thanks so much for coming on with us again here in Chicago.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show. This was a labor of love. This was a compilation of some of my best columns over the years, which were tributes to guys and gals who I had known in the business, and it's really it's a collection of tributes to men and women who made their mark on the wrestling profession. It's sort of an anthology of people stories, and these are unique individuals. It's about talented athletes who followed their dreams and lived by the credo, the show must go on.
I want to ask you about one of the figures in this book, and that's Wahoo McDaniel. I have been watching a ton of Mid-Atlantic on the WWE Network week after week after week, just to make sure that I'm getting an understanding of Dusty's booking, Dory Funk's booking during that time in the early 80s, and just seeing Wahoo go from babyface to heel. He was solid both, because now I'm in the middle of the two-man, he and Tully Blanchard going, as a two-man, wrecking crew going through Mid-Atlantic, and it's such fun television. What are your memories of Wahoo, both as a babyface and as a heel?
Well, Wahoo was he was good at both. Of course, his forte was being a big time babyface, and he was so popular, I think, because of his toughness. I don't know if there's ever been a tougher wrestler, maybe with the exception of Johnny Valentine, than Wahoo McDaniel. A lot of guys, including Ric Flair, said, Wahoo is the toughest guy I ever met, and he proved it on a football field, and he proved it in the wrestling ring. I can still feel those tremendous tomahawk chops that he threw against Valentine and Flair, and the sledgehammer blows that Valentine, threw back at Wahoo. And it's just unbelievable to see these guys. I saw so many Wahoo and Valentine matches over the years, and everyone was just totally brutal. But when he became a heel, he did that heel run. He was still tough. He didn't really change his character much. He just, kind of teamed with the bad guys on the roster, such as Tully. But there's so many great memories about Wahoo over the years, and I've chronicled a lot of this in one of the bios. He's in a section of my book called The Originals, and he certainly was an original. There are not too many guys that can just have one name and be identifiable. Wahoo was one of those guys. And everyone who played football with him, everyone who wrestled against him, to a man, they'll say that there were no tougher guys than Wahoo McDaniel.
The other person that's in this book is Jerry Brisco. I tell you, again, watching some of his vintage stuff, Mike, in Mid-Atlantic with the NWA, and just not just as a bad guy with his brother, but just he's one of these straight ahead bad guys where it's like, you know what, I'm great. I'm going to show you why I'm great. I'm not going to backpedal. I'm going to come right at you. I just think that he was a very unique character and obviously a great wrestler in his own right for many years.
Yeah, he was sort of a little bit in the shadow of his brother Jack. I mean, not too many people weren't. Jack was probably one of the greatest wrestlers to ever step inside a ring, collegiately or professionally. Mm-hmm. But I loved it when they, with the Brisco brothers, especially their run in the Carolinas with, and the feud they had with Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood. Mm-hmm. I mean, just some classic stuff, with Jerry wearing Jay Youngblood's Indian headdress and that kind of thing. But Jerry actually told me that the best time he ever had in the wrestling business was during that stretch here where he teamed with Brother Jack. And, you talk about tag teams, the Funks versus the Briscoes, brothers versus brothers. It was just tremendous stuff.
Mike Mooneyham, the book is entitled Final Bell, Legends of the Mat Remembered. As we talk about that book, again, you can find that book anywhere, right? Especially at was it eveningpostbooks.com?
Yeah, that's the main outlet right now, eveningpostbooks.com. I think in probably the middle part of May, it'll be up on Amazon. So it'll have a much greater reach. But right now you can get it from the eveningpostbooks.com site and also Barnes & Noble's website. But yeah, this was a fun book to do because I admired these people so much, but it was also a little heart-wrenching, because these guys, most of the people I wrote about were friends of mine in the business, and at the time, and these are from actual columns that appeared, a few days after their passing. So it was kind of tough for me to write them at the time. But then when I, started compiling, and I think there's 37 different people in here. Once I started compiling these bios, it just brought a smile to my face to see what joy and entertainment these guys brought to wrestling fans all over the world. We have this book divided into sort of different categories to have some level of separation. But we have a chapter called The Champions, and that's guys like Jack Brisco, Lou Fez, Vern Gagne. But we also have what we call the originals, which are guys like Wahoo, Johnny Valentine, Roddy Piper, Freddie Blassie. We have a section, the underrated, people like Eddie Guerrero, Danny Miller, Penny Banner, who was one of the great women wrestlers. And then something near and dear to my heart, the Mid-Atlantic mainstays and stars, George and Sandy Scott, Johnny Weaver, Tim Woods, Jay Youngblood, Rip Hawkins, Swede Hansen, many others. And then there's a section called the Brain Trust, sort of the people who made the magic behind the scenes. Guys like Jim Barnett, Henry Marcus, who was a friend of mine for over 50 years. He promoted here in the Carolinas and learned a lot of the tricks of the trade from him. Bobby Heenan, Gordon Soley, Lance Russell. So, it's a good division in the book of different types of performers. But yeah, this is a really, and of course I'm biased, but it's a really good book for anybody who's been a longtime fan of wrestling, and even for younger fans who really like what they see today, but want to have a sense of history. That's what you'll find in this book, and it's good reading, if I must say so myself.
Of course. You mentioned Henry Marcus. Was he someone that booked the towns in the Carolinas in his day?
Yeah, he was one of the main promoters for Jim Crockett Sr., and he's got a tremendous story. I mean, he promoted everything from pro wrestling to the Harlem Globetrotters to the original Superman and Lois Lane, the old rock and roll review shows. and I met him, early in my wrestling career, back in the 60s. He was a promoter here in Charleston, and he also promoted in Columbia and a couple of the other spot towns like Myrtle Beach and Florence. But it was every Friday night here in Charleston, every Tuesday night at the Township Auditorium in Columbia. And, I think he was as much the buildings as the mortar that held it together. He was a promoter extraordinaire, one of the old-time promoters who traveled the roads with guys like Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis, and, just had so many tremendous stories he shared over the years. And he was a great promoter. I mean, he was one of the old-time promoters along with Jim Crockett Sr., and for fans in this area, he was something special, and I would have been remiss not to have included him in this book because he was one of my favorites, and he was part of that fabric that really made wrestling such an enjoyable hobby to watch, and certainly for thousands of fans here in the Carolinas, he was part of the show.
You mentioned Penny Banner earlier, so when I think of Penny Banner, I think about the Fabulous Moolah, obviously.
Yeah.
What do you think, Mike, that Moolah would think of today's women's revolution in the business today?
She would love it. She would love it. She started her own revolution, years ago when she started training. She trained most of the girl wrestlers in the business during the 60s and 70s. 90% of the gals you saw were trained or booked by Moolah, and she really rolled with the flow. She became part of the show in the 80s during the Rock and Wrestle deal at WrestleMania, and she was a figure during the 90s during the Attitude Era with WWE. So she really rode that long wave and was one of the favorites of Vince McMahon Sr. and also Vince McMahon Jr. And she would have loved this. She took part in a lot of the stuff WWE did in recent years till her passing in 2007. But her and Mae Young, they were certainly an integral part, and Mae's featured in the book as well. I couldn't not include those two. Those were two of my favorite people. But yeah, she would love what's going on. Because she loved the showmanship, but she also loved the the wrestling part of it. And she would have been one of the main proponents if she'd still been around today.
Mike, I see that Jim Cornette was also involved in your book as well.
Yeah, Jim was kind enough to lend some nice words about the book and about myself. And Jimmy and I go way back. He probably knows as much about the wrestling business as anybody I've ever met. He's just, he's a creative genius. And Jimmy's a funny guy, and I was glad to have him on board. And also, thanks to Jim Ross and Les Thatcher for writing the forewords. That was, they're two of my longtime buddies in the business too. And I think for old school people, you're going to love this book. But I think for, like I said, people who are a little bit newer, fan wise, they're going to get some good history. And I also have some bios on China and Bobby Heenan and some of the recent people that we lost far too soon. One of my favorite bios in this book is Sputnik Monroe. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe a lot of fans don't know him today, but he's been around the business for a long time. He was the Diamond Ring and Cadillac Man, 235 pounds of twisted steel and sex appeal with the body men fear and women love. He was Stone Cold Steve Austin a long time before there was Stone Cold Steve Austin. He was a national symbol for the anti-establishment movement, could cut a promo like nobody, and was really an important figure in Memphis, Tennessee, where he really was as instrumental as anyone is leading the charge for integration at the pro wrestling shows in Memphis. At the time he began wrestling there, blacks were in one part of the building and whites were in another part. Blacks were in the balcony, and Sputnik would go on and say, "Look, I'm not going to wrestle here tonight until everybody sits together." And that was a big deal back then. We're talking a long time ago. And, Sputnik, he was he kind of like was a heel in the ring, sort of like Steve Austin would be years later. But he was a beloved heel. I mean, he was he spoke up for everyone, and it's a really colorful bio in this book. Is that's sort of one of my favorites.
Yeah, I look forward to reading that because I've heard Jim talk a lot about Sputnik Monroe because of his time in Memphis and his knowledge of Jerry Jarrett's promotions. So that's going to be an interesting read for sure. Again, it's a Final Bell. You can go to eveningpostbooks.com. Again, eveningpostbooks.com. You can get it there. And as Mike mentioned, later on in the month of May, you'll be able to pick it up on Amazon, Amazon.com. What I'm interested in wondering your thoughts about the movement by the NWA. Yes, it's current right now, and they just had an event in Concord, North Carolina on Saturday. I watched the event. And I tell you what, Mike, I was blown away by what the NWA is trying to do. They have a connection to the past and bringing it to the present. That ring was an NWA ring. I could have saw it any Mid-Atlantic card. I could when they turned that TV on and put that camera in center ring. I said, "Oh my God!" It looked like an old worldwide wrestling show from '85. It was great.
Yeah, I think Billy Corgan's got a good thing going. I think they're probably as close to the flavor of the original flavor of NWA as any kind of NWA-related promotion has been in years. And they're doing it the right way. They're doing it, they're respecting tradition. They're bringing back a lot of the guys, like Nikita was there, Rock and Roll Express, all of those guys that were big back in the NWA heyday. So I think they're doing it the right way. And they've got a bunch of new guys, too, who are really good. Nick Aldis, he's one of the best. There's a really good vibe about this, as well as, the All Elite Wrestling promotion that should be making some big noise pretty soon. So I think the more the merrier. That's good for the wrestling business. No one wants to see a one-man show. WWE is probably going to be dominant for years to come, but certainly there's room for other types of promotions such as AEW, the NWA, and if these promotions can survive and even flourish, it's going to be all good for the fans and the wrestling business in general. So, pretty pumped and excited about that.
It always comes back around, doesn't it, Mike? It
sure does, man. And you know what? I've been writing about wrestling for over 50 years now. Mm-hmm. That's a long haul. And I thought about it the other day, and I said, you know what? Where did the time go? I've seen the evolution of wrestling from back in the day. I was the big guy. One of my heroes back then was Lou Thesz. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, gee, Lou Thesz won his first NWA World title in 1937. And, I knew I was a friend of Lou's, and I greatly respected him, but that's going back a long ways. And I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen so many things about the wrestling business change, but, it's still here. I mean, and it's still flourishing. So that says a lot about the business in general. And by the way, this month is going to mark my 30th year of writing a column in the Sunday sports section of the Post and Courier. I can't believe it's been 30 years, but wow. Yeah, it's a long run.
Yeah, it certainly is. And again, for our Tuesday Wrestling fans, pick up the book, Final Bell. Eveningpostbooks.com is where you can find it. And again, it's going to be on Amazon later on this month. Well, I'm glad I spent some time with you, Mike, because I just want to get your thoughts. First of all, I want people to be aware of the book, but just kind of going through some of these names in the book, names that I'm familiar with, or names I read about in the magazines as a kid. It's just this is going to be fascinating, a fascinating read.
Well, I thank you. I always enjoy talking to you and being on your show. And if you don't go to eveningpostbooks.com, just Google Mike Mooneyham and Final Bell, and it'll come up. So, pretty easy to order. And like I said, I'm really proud of it, and I think people are going to like it.
My friend, as always, I appreciate your time, man. I'm going to tell you right now, I saw Nikita in Concord. I think he's ready. I think he's ready for another run.
Hey, I talk to Nikita all the time. I think he could get in a ring right now, get that little Russian voice back, and he never really lost it. It's amazing how he developed it, that Russian gimmick, as soon as he did. A kid from Minnesota, and he immediately turned into this Russian monster, the Russian nightmare. But, yeah, I think Nikita could give it a go. And, Ricky and Robert, they're still doing it 35 years later. They're, I guess they're still teenage idols to some and still doing their thing. And, hey, Ricky's got that mullet going strong.
He was busted open. It made me sad, Mike. He was busted open in that match. But here's the thing.
You know what?
But here's the thing.
They love
though,
it. It's no pun intended. It's in their blood.
Oh yeah, it is. But here he's over that second rope, and you know what he's doing? He had it right hand, and he was trying to reach out to that fan in the front row. And you know what they were doing? They were chanting "Rock and Roll." 2019, they're still doing it. He had his hands out there reaching out for help. It was great. It was like 85 again.
Oh, nobody makes a comeback like Ricky.
It was just unbelievable. It's my childhood all over again.
It takes you back, yeah. Well, quickly I might add, there's a sort of a successor to Fan Fest that's being held back in Charlotte at the same venue, the Hilton, University Hilton in Charlotte, second week in August, I believe, called The Gathering. And it's sort of like, Greg Price is not doing the Fan Fest anymore, but there's a guy named Martin D'Amato from New York with Team Up Promotions. They're presenting The Gathering, and it's like 3 or 4 days of probably going to be 100 wrestling legends there. So it's another big weekend in Charlotte for fans that love the Fan Fest over the years. This is going to be sort of like a little reunion of sorts.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Absolutely. If you are a fan of the NWA and Mid-Atlantic area, worldwide areas, as I used to say, it's going to be great. Mike, I always enjoy our conversations. Let's do it again.
We will. I'll be glad to, man.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Here's Mike Mooneyham. Final Bell is the name of the book, Legends of the Mat Remembered. Again, we told you where to find that. It's in our description of our podcast, as well as it's going to be available on Amazon pretty soon here in the month of May, so check that out. Mike Mooneyham with us here on Tuesday Wrestling Tuesday. Thanks so much for listening. Jonathan Hood on ESPN and the Under the Hood podcast.